America was born in fire and celebration, but it did not enter the world peacefully. When the Revolutionary War officially ended in 1783, church bells rang, cannons fired in triumph, and newspapers declared the arrival of a new republic. Yet beneath the surface of victory, the country was already unraveling. The people who had fought for freedom returned home to empty pockets, ruined farms, and a government that barely existed. Soldiers were promised pay that never arrived. Farmers who had abandoned their fields to fight the British now found themselves drowning in debt. Cities struggled to function, trade routes collapsed, currency lost value almost overnight. The United States had defeated the greatest empire on earth, but it could not govern itself. There was no strong federal authority. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no power to collect taxes, no standing army, and no real way to enforce laws. Each state acted like an independent nation, printing its own money, negotiating its own trade agreements, and passing laws that often contradicted one another. Traveling from Virginia to Pennsylvania felt like crossing international borders. What Americans called a union was, in reality, a fragile alliance held together by memory of war and little else. The economic crisis hit hardest in rural communities. Wartime inflation had driven prices sky high, and when peace arrived, markets collapsed. Credit vanished. Banks demanded repayment in hard currency that barely existed. Courts began seizing farms at alarming rates. Families who had lived on the same land for generations were suddenly evicted. Veterans who had once marched under Washington now stood in debtors' prisons, shackled for owing money to wealthy creditors who had avoided the war entirely. Anger spread like wildfire. Former revolutionaries started asking dangerous questions. Had they traded one distant king for local tyrants? Was this what liberty looked like? The same men who had shouted "no taxation without representation" now faced crushing taxes imposed by their own governments. The promise of equality felt hollow as political power concentrated in the hands of merchants, bankers, and lawyers. A new elite was rising, and the common people could feel it. At the same time, foreign empires watched closely. Britain still occupied strategic forts along America's western frontier, violating peace agreements and quietly encouraging native resistance to American expansion. Spain controlled Louisiana and Florida, hoping instability would keep the young republic boxed in. France, deeply invested after financing the revolution, feared default on massive loans. Across Europe, monarchs whispered that the American experiment was already failing. They did not need to attack. They simply waited for Americans to tear themselves apart. By 1786, unrest had turned into organized resistance. In Massachusetts, one of the poorest states after the war, desperation reached a breaking point. Farmers faced heavy taxes and aggressive debt collection. Courts operated relentlessly, issuing foreclosures and imprisoning those who could not pay. In town after town, citizens gathered and agreed on a radical solution: shut down the courts. Armed groups began marching on courthouses, blocking judges from entering and forcing legal proceedings to halt. What began as protests soon became rebellion. Leading these desperate men was Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Continental Army. Shays had fought bravely against the British, but returned home to poverty and debt. Like thousands of others, he felt betrayed by the government he had helped create. Under his leadership, nearly 2,000 armed farmers organized into disciplined militias. They drilled, marched in formation, and carried the same weapons they had once used against imperial troops. This was not chaos, this was organized insurrection. The rebels demanded debt relief, lower taxes, and paper money to ease economic suffering. When the state government refused, they escalated. They seized courthouses. They confronted militias. They attempted to capture the federal arsenal at Springfield, hoping to arm themselves further. Shots were fired. Men were wounded. Blood was spilled. America had entered its first internal war. The national government could do nothing. Congress had no army to deploy. There was no federal funding to suppress the rebellion. Massachusetts had to rely on privately financed troops paid for by wealthy merchants, terrified that the uprising would spread. Brothers stood on opposite sides of the battlefield. Revolutionary veterans faced off against former comrades. For the first time, Americans aimed muskets at fellow Americans not in the name of independence, but in a fight over what independence actually meant. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but the damage was irreversible. News of Shays' rebellion sent shockwaves through the political class. George Washington, who had retired quietly to Mount Vernon, was pulled back into public life. James Madison warned that the Republic was on the brink of anarchy. Alexander Hamilton argued that without a stronger central government, the United States would dissolve entirely. Thomas Jefferson, watching from France, famously remarked that a little rebellion now and then was healthy, but even he underestimated how close the nation had come to collapse. Behind closed doors, America's leaders admitted the truth. The system had failed. This fear led directly to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Officially, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. In reality, they dismantled them entirely. What emerged was a radically new form of government designed not just to unite states, but to control internal unrest. The presidency was strengthened, federal taxation was authorized, a national army became permanent. Power shifted decisively away from local populations and toward centralized authority. The Constitution was not written in triumph. It was written in terror. But Shays' rebellion was only the beginning. Over the next decade, unrest continued. In 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania rose up against the federal whiskey tax they saw as unfairly targeting rural communities. This time, President Washington personally led troops to suppress the rebellion, sending a clear message: the new government would tolerate no armed resistance. On the frontier, violent conflicts with native tribes intensified, often fueled by British support. In the South, enslaved populations planned revolts inspired by the Haitian Revolution, spreading fear among plantation owners and prompting harsher controls. America was not healing. It was hardening. The early republic became a nation defined by internal struggle. Economic inequality deepened. Political parties formed out of bitter disagreements. States argued constantly with federal authorities. Every decade brought new crises, new rebellions, and new compromises that postponed rather than solved the underlying conflicts. What began as class warfare slowly transformed into sectional warfare. Northern industry and southern agriculture drifted apart. Debates over slavery expanded westward. Arguments about states' rights intensified. The same questions raised by desperate farmers in the 1780s echoed through Congress halls in the 1800s. Who truly held power? Who deserved protection? And what happened when ordinary Americans felt abandoned? By the time cannons fired in 1861, the nation had already been fighting itself for generations. The famous Civil War was not a sudden tragedy. It was the final eruption of pressures that had been building since the very first days of independence. America's first Civil War had already been fought. Most people simply forgot. As the young republic staggered forward, it carried deep scars from its earliest internal conflicts. Shays' rebellion had been crushed, but its lessons reshaped the nation. The federal government now possessed real power. A standing army existed. Taxes could be collected. Laws could be enforced across state lines. To the political elite, this was stability. To many ordinary citizens, it felt like the return of tyranny under a new name. The 1790s became a decade of uneasy control. The government moved quickly to prove it would not tolerate resistance. Nowhere was this clearer than in western Pennsylvania, where farmers relied heavily on whiskey production. Grain was bulky and difficult to transport over mountain roads, but whiskey could be easily traded and used as currency. When the federal government imposed an excise tax on distilled spirits in 1791, frontier communities saw it as an attack on their survival. Wealthy eastern producers paid the tax with ease. Rural farmers did not. Anger boiled over. Tax collectors were threatened, tarred, and driven out of towns. Armed groups formed. Meetings were held in secret, militias drilled in forest clearings. For these farmers, the whiskey tax represented everything they had fought against during the Revolution. Distant lawmakers imposing economic hardship on people they did not understand. By 1794, the situation exploded into open defiance. Thousands of armed men marched through the countryside, burning property and vowing resistance. The federal government responded with overwhelming force. President George Washington personally led nearly 13,000 troops into Pennsylvania, the only time in American history a sitting president has commanded soldiers in the field. The message was unmistakable: the era of tolerated rebellion was over. The Whiskey Rebellion collapsed without major bloodshed, but the precedent was set. The federal government had proven it would use military power against its own citizens. America was no longer a loose collection of states. It was a centralized authority prepared to enforce obedience. Yet beneath this display of strength, tensions continued to simmer. On the expanding frontier, violence was constant. Settlers poured westward into native lands, igniting brutal conflicts across Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and beyond. Native confederations, often supplied by British agents still operating from Canada, resisted fiercely. Entire villages were burned, crops destroyed, families displaced. These were not isolated skirmishes, they were prolonged, undeclared wars that defined daily life for thousands of Americans. For frontier settlers, survival meant violence. For native tribes, it meant extinction. At the same time, another storm brewed in the South. Enslaved populations closely followed events in Haiti, where enslaved people had risen up and overthrown French colonial rule. The Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves through slaveholding states. Plantation owners feared similar uprisings. Their fears were not unfounded. In 1800, Gabriel Prosser organized a massive slave revolt in Virginia, planning to seize Richmond and demand freedom. Though the plot was discovered before it could unfold, it revealed just how close the country came to widespread insurrection. More revolts followed. Denmark Vesey in South Carolina, Nat Turner in Virginia. Each uprising intensified paranoia and repression. Laws grew harsher, patrols became more aggressive. The South increasingly defined itself around the defense of slavery, while the North moved slowly toward abolition. The nation was splitting along moral, economic, and cultural lines. Meanwhile, foreign powers continued to meddle. Britain restricted American trade, seized ships, and impressed sailors into the Royal Navy. Spain attempted to block access to the Mississippi River. France pulled the United States into diplomatic crises that nearly sparked war. America found itself surrounded by empires eager to exploit its weaknesses. Every internal conflict made the Republic look more vulnerable. These pressures culminated in the War of 1812, a conflict often called America's Second War of Independence, but it was also another internal trial. New England states opposed the war. Southern and western regions supported it. Militias refused federal orders. Some politicians openly discussed secession. Even during foreign war, America fought itself. The pattern was clear. Every generation faced rebellion, resistance, and division. The federal government grew stronger with each crisis. Ordinary citizens grew more distrustful. The distance between elites and common people widened. By the 1820s and 1830s, America entered an age of rapid expansion and industrial growth. Canals were built, railroads appeared. Cities exploded in size, but prosperity was uneven. Northern factories thrived while southern plantations doubled down on enslaved labor. Western territories became battlegrounds over whether new states would allow slavery. The Missouri Compromise temporarily balanced free and slave states, but it solved nothing. It merely postponed conflict. Political rhetoric became sharper. Newspapers printed vicious attacks. Congressional debates turned violent. In 1856, a senator was nearly beaten to death on the Senate floor over slavery. Kansas descended into chaos as pro-slavery and anti-slavery militias battled in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Homes were burned, settlements destroyed. Murders committed in the name of ideology. America was already at war with itself. Families argued over politics. Churches split, communities fractured. Every election felt like a national crisis. The question of slavery poisoned every conversation about rights, power, and freedom. And behind it all lingered the unresolved legacy of the earliest rebellions. Who truly controlled the country, the people, or the government? By the late 1850s, compromise had failed. Trust had evaporated. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, Southern states began seceding almost immediately. They did not see it as rebellion. They saw it as self-defense against a system they believed no longer represented them. And so, in 1861, the cannons finally fired. But this was not the beginning. It was the culmination. What Americans called the Civil War was simply the largest chapter in a long story of internal conflict that had started the moment independence was declared. From Shays' Rebellion to the Whiskey Rebellion, from frontier wars to slave uprisings, from economic revolts to sectional violence, the United States had been fighting itself for nearly 80 years. The nation had survived not because it avoided civil war, but because it endured many smaller ones along the way. By the time the Civil War officially began in 1861, America had already mastered the language of conflict. Violence was no longer shocking. Division was no longer surprising. Generations had grown up watching protests turn into riots, political arguments turn into armed standoffs, and economic desperation explode into rebellion. What made this moment different was scale. The tensions that had simmered for decades were finally concentrated into two opposing visions of the nation. In the North, industrialization transformed society. Factories multiplied, railroads connected cities, and immigrant labor flooded urban centers. Wealth accumulated rapidly, but unevenly. A powerful business class emerged, tied closely to banks and federal policy. For many Northerners, the future meant progress, commerce, and centralized authority. They increasingly viewed slavery not just as a moral evil, but as an economic obstacle to national growth. In the South, life revolved around agriculture and enslaved labor. Cotton dominated global markets, and plantation owners depended entirely on slavery to maintain their wealth and social hierarchy. Southern leaders framed federal interference as an existential threat. To them, abolition was not simply a moral debate, it was economic destruction. They believed their way of life was under siege. Both sides spoke the language of freedom. Both claimed to defend the Constitution, neither trusted the other. The political system strained under the pressure. Compromises came and went, each weaker than the last. The Compromise of 1850 temporarily postponed disaster, but included harsh measures like the Fugitive Slave Act, forcing Northerners to participate in the return of escaped slaves. This only deepened resentment. The Kansas-Nebraska Act reopened the slavery question in Western territories, leading directly to bloodshed. Armed settlers crossed state lines to influence elections. Rival governments formed, vigilante justice replaced law. Bleeding Kansas became a preview of what was coming. The violence wasn't spontaneous. It was organized, ideological, and deeply personal. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Churches split. Families were divided by loyalty to North or South. Newspapers inflamed passions with sensational headlines. Politicians used fear to mobilize supporters. Every debate became a test of national survival. In 1857, the Supreme Court delivered its infamous Dred Scott decision, declaring that Black Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. For abolitionists, this confirmed their worst fears. The federal government was protecting slavery at the highest level. For slaveholders, it was validation of their rights. Instead of settling the issue, the ruling pushed the country closer to catastrophe. Then came John Brown. In 1859, Brown led a small group of followers in an armed raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His goal was radical and unprecedented: to spark a massive slave uprising across the South. The plan failed. Brown was captured, tried, and executed. But his actions sent shockwaves through the nation. To many in the North, Brown became a martyr. To the South, he was proof that abolitionists were willing to use terrorism to destroy their society. Trust collapsed completely. Southern states began preparing for separation. Militias drilled openly, weapons were stockpiled. Political leaders debated secession not as a last resort, but as an inevitable step. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860 without carrying a single Southern state, it was interpreted as confirmation that the South no longer had a voice in national government. Within weeks, South Carolina seceded, others followed. What made the Civil War inevitable was not Lincoln nor slavery alone. It was the accumulated weight of decades of unresolved conflict, economic inequality, regional identity, fear of centralized power, cultural division. The same forces that drove farmers to rebel in the 1780s now drove entire states to break away. America was repeating its earliest trauma on a massive scale. As armies formed and borders hardened, many Americans believed the war would be short. They had seen rebellions crushed before. They assumed compromise or quick victory would restore order. Instead, the conflict consumed over 600,000 lives and permanently reshaped the nation. But even as cannons roared, the deeper story remained hidden beneath the headlines. The Civil War was not an isolated rupture. It was the final phase of America's first long internal struggle. Long before blue and gray uniforms faced each other across battlefields, ordinary citizens had fought against debt, taxation, displacement, and political exclusion. Shays farmers had marched for economic justice. Whiskey rebels had resisted federal authority. Frontier settlers had battled for land. Enslaved people had risked everything for freedom. Each uprising revealed cracks in the system. Each compromise papered over wounds without healing them. The Founding Fathers had built a government designed to survive rebellion, not prevent it, and survive it did. After the Civil War ended, the United States emerged more centralized, more powerful, and more industrialized than ever before. Federal authority was unquestionable, states' rights were redefined. A national identity slowly solidified. But the cost was immense. Reconstruction brought new conflicts. Jim Crow laws enforced racial hierarchy. Economic inequality persisted. The same patterns of unrest reappeared in labor strikes, civil rights movements, and political protests. The original questions never disappeared. Who controls power? Who benefits from the system? What happens when large portions of the population feel unheard? These were the same questions raised in courthouse protests in Massachusetts nearly a century earlier. The true story of America's first Civil War is not found in textbooks that begin in 1861. It lives in forgotten rebellions, silenced voices, and overlooked struggles that shaped the nation from its earliest days. It is a story of ordinary people colliding with institutions, of ideals tested by reality, and of a republic constantly balancing between unity and fracture. Foreign powers once watched this fragile experiment with quiet anticipation. Some hoped America would fail. Others feared it might succeed too well. Today the world still watches. Because the United States was never forged in calm. It was forged in conflict. By the time the smoke cleared after Appomattox, America stood transformed. The Civil War had ended slavery, preserved the Union, and rewritten the balance of power between states and the federal government. But beneath these monumental changes lay a quieter truth. The nation had finally resolved, through unimaginable bloodshed, conflicts that had existed since its birth. What began as scattered farmer uprisings, frontier skirmishes, and political rebellions had culminated in total war. Yet peace did not bring healing. Reconstruction promised a new beginning, but delivered a fragile compromise. Former Confederate states were reintegrated, but racial equality remained largely theoretical. Federal troops enforced order temporarily, while Southern resentment simmered beneath the surface. Newly freed Black Americans attempted to build lives from the ashes of slavery, only to face violence, intimidation, and legal systems designed to keep them powerless. Jim Crow laws replaced chains with statutes. Sharecropping replaced plantations. Political progress was reversed through terror campaigns carried out by groups determined to preserve the old hierarchy. The cycle repeated. Once again, a group that felt dispossessed turned to resistance. Once again, the federal government responded with force or withdrawal depending on political convenience. Once again, promises made during crisis faded during peace. Economic divisions deepened as America entered the Gilded Age, industrial. Barons accumulated extraordinary wealth while factory workers labored in brutal conditions. Railroad strikes shut down cities. Labor protests were met with private militias and federal troops. The same pattern from the 1780s reappeared in modern form. Ordinary citizens demanding fairness, powerful interests demanding order. The language had changed. The conflict had not. By the early 20th century, the United States projected power far beyond its borders. It had become an empire in all but name, fighting wars overseas while managing unrest at home. Civil rights movements challenged segregation. Anti-war protests filled streets. Political assassinations shook the nation. Each generation confronted its own version of the same foundational struggle: who America was for and who it left behind. These recurring upheavals reveal something uncomfortable. America's stability has always been negotiated through confrontation. The country did not grow because it avoided internal conflict. It grew because it survived it repeatedly. Every rebellion forced adaptation. Every uprising reshaped institutions. Every crisis expanded federal authority. What began with Shays farmers demanding debt relief eventually produced a superpower capable of projecting military force across the globe. But that power came at a price. The early rebels of Massachusetts never imagined they were helping create a centralized government strong enough to crush future resistance. The founders who feared mob rule could not foresee how their solutions would concentrate influence in distant capitals. Each attempt to prevent chaos also reduced local control. Each safeguard against collapse strengthened the center. This was the paradox at the heart of the American experiment. Freedom required structure. Structure required authority. Authority inevitably created resistance. America's first civil war was not a single event. It was a process. A long, painful negotiation between ideals and reality that began the moment independence was declared. The revolution overthrew British rule, but it did not resolve questions of equality, power, or justice. Those debates simply shifted inward. And the world noticed. Foreign empires once waited for America to fail. Today, global powers study its divisions with the same quiet interest. Political polarization, economic inequality, social unrest, and external influence campaigns echo patterns from centuries past. The players have changed, the dynamics remain. The United States was never meant to be easy. It was designed to be tested. Every generation inherits unfinished business from the last. Every crisis exposes weaknesses in the system, and every period of calm is temporary. The forgotten Civil War before 1861 teaches us something vital. Nations are not destroyed by disagreement alone. They fall apart when people lose faith that change is possible within the system. In the 1780s, desperate farmers believed courts and legislatures no longer served them. In the 1850s, entire states reached the same conclusion. Each time, Americans faced a choice between reform and rupture. Sometimes they chose reform, sometimes they chose war. America survived because enough people, at critical moments, decided the Union was worth saving even when they disagreed violently about what that Union should look like. That struggle continues. The true legacy of America's first Civil War is not found in monuments or battlefields. It lives in protests, elections, courtrooms, and public debates. It lives in the constant tension between individual liberty and collective order. It lives in the question every democracy must eventually answer: how do you hold a diverse society together without silencing it? The United States was not born unified. It was born arguing. And perhaps that is its defining trait. From unpaid soldiers to angry farmers, from enslaved rebels to seceding states, from labor strikes to civil rights marches, the story has always been the same. Progress arrives through conflict. Stability is temporary. Democracy is fragile. America did not become strong because it avoided civil war. It became strong because it endured one long before most people remember. And as history shows us again and again, the greatest danger is not division itself, but forgetting how close the country has come to falling apart. The first Civil War was not fought between North and South. It was fought between expectation and reality, between promise and experience, between the idea of America and the people trying to live inside it. And that battle, in many ways, never truly ended.